Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Miloš Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So Miloš, it's been another eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
Yeah, this week we got some news from Washington where the United States President Donald Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, after which Trump insisted that negotiations with Iran would continue. And all the while, Israel is reportedly preparing for a new ground offensive against Hamas. Shifting to the Indo Pacific, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is considering constitutional reform following her party's victory in Parliament, while the United States is preparing a new arms sale to Taiwan. And then here in the Americas, Cuba has warned airlines that they would no longer be able to refuel on the island amid the country's energy crisis following an oil embargo that was imposed by the US this week. And then finally, on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has accepted a US invitation to participate in peace talks in Miami next week, while the European Union is reportedly preparing a list of concessions it is expected to demand from Russia. So lots to get into.
Great, thanks Miloš. So let's start off, as we have in recent weeks, with the Middle East. So Andrew, turning to you here, we've seen a lot of developments as we've been discussing around the Iranian theater, and in particular a lot of diplomatic activity that's been going on. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so last week we recorded just before the first round of talks between the United States and Iran, hosted in Muscat. Following those meetings, there hasn't been a significant amount of detail that came out. However, we do know that the talks went well enough that U.S. President Donald Trump wants to keep the door open. In fact, in saying that he insists that negotiations with Iran will continue. These comments from the American president come after a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House on Wednesday, February 11th. An interesting meeting in that it was very much kept under wraps. Of course, the schedule was public, but there was not a lot of fanfare with the press or for the Prime Minister's arrival at the White House, for that matter. A quick in and out meeting for Netanyahu. What the Israeli Prime Minister and the American president were discussing almost certainly were a difference in opinion over what exactly the negotiations with Iran should focus on. There's essentially a split right now between these two allies. The Israelis are pushing for an all or nothing set of talks, meaning specifically the Iranian nuclear program, basically every Iranian domestic conventional weapons program, ballistic missiles and such, as well as Iran's support to its proxy network throughout the region. The U.S., just prior to the talks in Oman, was going in insisting that all three items had to be on the table. There was a flurry of diplomatic activity from U.S. allies in the region, primarily from Turkey, and the U.S., at least for now, seems to be content to pursue exclusively a nuclear deal. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has said very confidently and optimistically that in his assessment, both the United States and Iran are prepared to compromise and reach a deal specifically over uranium enrichment. He cautioned, however, that if the U.S. decides to put everything on the table, so the domestic missile program and regional support to proxies, not only would the talks collapse, but in his words, there would be another war in the region. And then at the same time, as these talks are going on, and I'll note that both the United States and Iran are negotiating for another round of talks to take place soon, likely in Muscat again, although of course that could change at last minute. The U.S. has a significant amount of military assets positioned off the Iranian coast right now, including an aircraft carrier and its strike group. Trump has threatened to double that, to deploy another aircraft carrier to the region. That has not happened yet, I will note. At the same time, we've seen some interesting reports that the U.S. has decided against seizing any additional Iranian oil tankers while these talks are ongoing, specifically in the interest of preventing destabilization to global markets. A deterrent effect from Iran, the Iranians could choose to retaliate by mining the Strait of Hormuz in the event of U.S. seizure of their vessels.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, it looks like we are trending right now towards that diplomatic de-escalation scenario, though, as you mentioned, there's still quite some tensions happening in this region, and the U.S. retains some military assets there. And of course, Israel is looking to increase the pressure to kind of incorporate all of those different elements of the negotiations rather than just the nuclear program. So we'll definitely keep a close eye on this topic moving forward. And then in the meantime, speaking of Israel, there's been some notable developments in both Gaza and the West Bank. So what can you update us there?
Right, both in Gaza and the West Bank this week, it's a story of escalation. Beginning in Gaza, at least 8 Palestinians were killed from Israeli fire this week, and Israel is said to be preparing for a ground offensive to achieve the disarmament of Hamas. Of course, that would effectively end the current ceasefire deal that is in place. The disarmament of Hamas remains the most significant obstacle to implementing the deal that Hamas itself, and of course Israel and the United States have agreed to. Again, we were talking about some contentions between Israel and the U.S. right now over the direction of talks with Iran. The same thing exists right now with diplomatic efforts inside of Gaza, where the United States is insisting that it can proceed with phase 2 of Trump's ceasefire plan and begin implementing a post-Hamas government structure. And of course, the Israelis are insisting that is impossible while Hamas still maintains essentially all of its arms. And then turning to the West Bank now, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved a set of decisions to, quote, dramatically reduce the bureaucratic hurdles required for Jewish Israeli citizens to purchase land in the West Bank. And that description dramatically comes from Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, and a similar description from Israel's Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Essentially, what this does is it expedites the process of the gradual annexation of additional land inside the West Bank. This is one of the few areas, at least publicly, where the Trump administration speaks out against its Israeli allies. We have seen at least a couple official statements from the U.S. government so far in opposition to this move by the Israelis.
Understood. So let's move on to our next global hotspot, which is the Indo Pacific, where we saw some very notable elections in Japan and a lot of regional and global implications from those elections. So Milos, what can you update us on that front?
Yeah, so Japan was in the news, as you mentioned, because of these elections. And just to remind everyone, this was something that the Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, had floated back in January. And last weekend, these snap elections actually were held in the lower house of parliament in Japan. And the Liberal Democratic Party, so the ruling party, went from being in a minority government position into a sweeping victory, essentially holding 2/3 of the majority in the lower house of parliament. So this was something that obviously really benefits the Prime Minister. She had some very good approval ratings since taking office last year, so she wanted to capitalize on that. That gambit has evidently paid off. Now, as to what this means for Japan itself, we know from her election campaign that a big thing she wanted to talk about was possible constitutional reform, something that when her party was in the minority position, she was slightly less able to put across on the agenda. But it looks like now there's been some strong signaling from her and her party that this is something that she wants to bring back on the table. In fact, a direct quote from her was that she wants to create an environment suitable for a referendum to reform the constitution. Now, there are some steps that would be required for this, including, parties in the parliament proposing some amendments that would then have to be submitted and approved by a 2/3 majority in both chambers of parliament. But this is particularly notable because of the possible amendments to the role of the current self-defense forces. And we know that this was something that has been on the agenda in the past. This was a big ambition of Shinzo Abe, a prime minister who the current prime minister was a big, advocate for and was working in his government. So this is something that undoubtedly she has worked on in the past. But there are some questions still remaining. For a start, some of the smaller opposition parties may not want to completely give full reign of reform to the ruling party. And there are some divisions even amongst Takaichi's allies, with some members of some more parties that are advocating for even stronger reforms that perhaps aren't fully palatable by everyone in parliament. So lots of questions there still remaining. But what we do know is that this has boosted Takaichi's good standing. And we want to zoom out a second and just look at what this means with relations to the United States. Because as we remember, one of the reasons that she had as good an approval rating as she did was because of her perceived good handling of relations with President Trump. And so, in fact, this week we did actually get some news that the US and Japan are closing in on some of the first projects that should be funded by this really large, over $500 billion investment vehicle that was agreed upon between Japan and the US a couple of months ago. So we don't know the full extent of this. Some sources close to the Prime Minister have speculated that these are some projects related to data center infrastructure planning, deep sea oil terminals, and semiconductors as well. And after a selection is made for sure, it looks like we'll have about a month and a half for Japan to approve, or rather to start funding the initiative. So we don't know yet whether these projects have been approved, but as I said, sources telling us that things are moving. And in fact, we know that Howard Lutnick, the US Secretary of Commerce, is meeting with his Japanese counterpart today. So I assume that we will probably be hearing more about this over the course of the weekend. But one thing's for certain is I reckon the Prime Minister is going to be wanting to continue on her good fortune at the moment, and it is likely that we hear some favourable agreement between the United States and Japan in the coming days.
Gotcha. And speaking of the United States, there's been some notable developments related to both Taiwan and China. So what can you update us on that front?
Yeah, so the news this week related to that was that there are some sources close to the president who have revealed that the administration is preparing a new weapons sale to Taiwan. And this would specifically involve the Patriot air defense missile system that has also been on sale and has been delivered to Ukraine to great effect for the Ukrainians. So this is something that Taiwan is very keen to have and to keep receiving from the United States. But there are other sources that are saying that this is quite a large weapons package that is being delivered, potentially reaching up to $20 billion worth of weapons being sold to Taiwan, although that is unconfirmed. But this is notable considering that last week we covered a story that President Trump had a phone call with Chinese President Xi, during which time Xi had warned Trump to essentially just to tread carefully with arms sales to Taiwan. And and this announcement from this week wasn't even, made through like public channels, but already we've gotten a reaction from China saying that there is a danger that this could jeopardize a potential meeting between both presidents in the spring. Now, there is a mood in both countries to keep relations going, especially on the commercial angle. So it is unlikely that the meeting in spring is set to be cancelled completely. And we also know that there are some gestures of goodwill being made by both countries. And this week, in fact, trading reports showed that China had been increasing its orders of US agricultural products over the past 3 months, in line with what was agreed upon last October. So chances are, the meeting between Trump and Xi that was predicted a couple of months ago is still going to happen. But depending on what is in this weapons sale that the US is going to deliver to Taiwan, we could see some form of mild, trade retaliation or possibly some red lines imposed by China ahead of the meeting. So we'll be keeping an eye on that.
Got it. Thanks. And let's move on to our next global hotspot of the U.S. and the Americas. And we'll stick with you here, Miloš, to give us an update on the U.S. domestic front, both politically and on the trade front. So what can you update the listeners from this week?
Yeah, so on the trade front, we saw a rift forming amongst House Republicans this week, as we saw that 6 House Republican lawmakers joined efforts from the Democratic Party in voting on a measure that would essentially curb the Trump administration's ability to impose further tariffs on Canada. So this is a measure that still has to clear the Senate, though there is, even if it does clear the Senate, there's a strong possibility that Trump would veto the measure. And that could potentially be overturned if there is a 2/3 majority in both chambers that decides to do so. We're not quite sure that that would be the case, but it is notable to see that there is a rift forming once again within the Republican Party, as we know that Canada is one of the top trading partners of the United States, and a lot of lawmakers are keen to avoid any further tariffs being imposed as a tax on their constituents. And then on the more domestic front, we actually got news today, and I should note that we are recording this on Thursday, February 12th, from the border czar, Tom Homan, who announced that the administration would end its aggressive immigration enforcement campaign in Minnesota. So here as well, details scarce. We just received the news today. What we do know is that Homan has said that he was pledging to no longer deploy any new federal agents to the state of Minnesota, making no comment on existing numbers. And his reasoning for this is, he was citing increased cooperation by local law enforcement agencies and agents. So notable development there, especially considering that the Department of Homeland Security is still at risk of facing a potential funding freeze from Congress, as the debate surrounding the department's involvement in law enforcement activities is still raging on. So likely to hear more on that, more details in the next following days as well.
Understood. And then elsewhere in the Americas, there's been a lot of significant developments related to U.S. pressure on Cuba. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, this seems to be the new hotspot in the Caribbean from the media's perspective. And this week, actually, we've seen that the Trump administration has been increasing pressure on Cuba. So last week, we got the news that Trump had basically set the terms for the possibility of adding tariffs to any nation that supplies Cuba with oil. And this week, he actually went ahead by cutting off any oil shipments to Venezuela through an embargo around the island. And this has had quite a strong effect on Cuba. As I mentioned up top, the Cuban government actually made an announcement warning basically of fuel shortages. And this would have a great effect, especially on any stopover airplane transits to the country. And this will notably affect any longer flight paths, so not necessarily shorter, flights within the region, but we're talking long flights coming from Russia or from Canada, both of which in the past have strongly supported Cuba's tourism industry. So we're seeing a runoff effect on the economy as a whole. So we've already seen a few other domestic services being impacted, including the functioning of public transport, as well as the banking sector. So as far as international reactions have gone from Cuba's allies, we have seen China and Russia step in, with China saying that it is pledging to do what it can to help Cuba, though without specifying publicly how it would do so. And Russia saying that it was planning to send oil as part of a humanitarian aid to the island in the not too distant future. So whether or not and to what extent both of those go ahead remains to be seen. But clearly a strong escalation point in the region to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we had noted following the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, that Cuba was one of the leading countries to watch for further U.S. action in the region. It seems like right now the U.S. is looking at a hybrid escalation scenario, to basically pressure Cuba and its government, especially when it comes to ties with countries like Russia and China, as you mentioned. So we'll be paying very close attention here as that escalation continues to play out. And then finally, pivoting to our final global hotspot of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As we've been discussing in recent weeks, there's been quite a lot of diplomatic activity and some levels of de-escalation. So, Andrew, what can you update us there on the diplomatic front over Russia-Ukraine?
Yeah, so in a similar way to what we were just discussing between diplomatic efforts with the U.S. and Iran, there's a lot of significant movement, but not too much detail right now. So specifically, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has committed to an invite from the United States to attend a new round of peace talks that the U.S. will host in Miami from February 17th to the 18th. The Ukrainian president, in his own words, accepted the offer basically immediately. Zelenskyy also noted that Russia has not yet committed to sending a delegation to the planned talks. I checked recently before we started recording, and I still have not seen any word on that. The Ukrainians, of course, are very eager for this meeting. However, no real updates right now on the big story of these talks over the last couple of weeks, which of course is the draft of security guarantee proposals that the Ukrainians had put together, and that Zelenskyy had said a number of times publicly are ready for President Trump's signature essentially immediately. But we'll keep our eye on that. The other big diplomatic story between the U.S. and Russia right now is, of course, on the START treaty. Last week we discussed how the START treaty expired without a commitment from either Russia or the U.S. to immediately renegotiate a new deal. What we understand now is that Russian President Vladimir Putin made an offer to Trump to extend the details of the START treaty by exactly 1 year, just to keep it afloat for the time being. President Trump rejected that offer and said that he would prefer to negotiate a, quote, new and improved deal. But beyond that, there's no significant updates other than the U.S. and Russia are presumably negotiating another meeting to discuss what that new proposal from Trump would look like. Then at the same time, the Vice President of the European Commission, Kaja Kallas, who is essentially the EU's chief diplomat and foreign policy lead, is leading an effort right now, a diplomatic effort inside the European Union to put together a list of concessions that it will demand from Russia as part of its own efforts to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine, of course, within the context of this general diplomatic push from the United States.
Understood. And is there anything that listeners should be aware of on the military and hybrid fronts for the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Definitely. As usual, when we're focusing on significant diplomatic updates between Russia and Ukraine, the situation on the ground in Ukraine remains very difficult. Essentially, any way that you look at it, along the front, Russian forces are intensifying their ground campaign against the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. If that sounds like a familiar headline, it's because Pokrovsk has been grabbing attention in the media for a number of months now due to this Russian offensive. The Ukrainian army currently maintains a foothold in the northern part of the city, which prior to the start of this Russian offensive had around, I believe, a population of 60,000. And then at the same time, Russia, of course, is sustaining its bombardment against Ukrainian cities across the country, as well as specifically against Ukrainian energy infrastructure to significant effect in Odessa right now, both in the city of Odessa in the area around it in the oblast. At least 300,000 people are believed to be without power and running water as a result of ongoing Russian bombardment against the region's energy infrastructure.
Got it. So that's about all that we have time for today. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.